Chapter 12 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 9, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 12, Atlanta. On the 17th of July, Sherman began his march upon Atlanta. Thomas moved directly towards that city. Schofield took the road to Decatur, and McPherson, still further to the left, was to strike the railroad between Decatur and Stone Mountain. Johnston, being instantly apprised of this order of march, took up his position for defense on Peachtree Creek, a little rivulet north and east of Atlanta, which flows into the Chattahoochee near the railroad bridge. He resolved to throw the greater part of his own force against the right wing of Sherman, under Thomas, before Schofield and McPherson could come up from the left. But, while planning his attack, he received this dispatch from the Confederate Adjutant General. Quote, I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, far in the interior of Georgia, and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from the command of the Army and Department of Tennessee, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood. Unquote. This action of the Confederate government was entirely unexpected by General Johnston. He was aware of the hostile feeling existing towards him in the Confederate executive, but only a few days before, General Bragg had passed through his camp on his way to Kirby Smith's department to ascertain, as he said, what reinforcements could be forthcoming from that region to General Johnston. And he had also received from Governor Brown of Georgia the gratifying intelligence that within a few days he could give him reinforcements of 10,000 state militia. It is true he had received dispatches from Richmond indicating a certain degree of dissatisfaction with his policy of retreat, and he had only recently had a telegram from the Secretary of War demanding positive information as to his plans and purposes, to which Johnston had replied in his usual manner, declining to commit himself positively to any especial course of action. It was this reply of Johnston's, Jefferson Davis says, which induced him to take the decisive step. He had long hesitated to do this, knowing Johnston's popularity in the Confederacy, and conscious that his own prejudice against him was well known and criticized throughout the country. Johnston at once wrote and published an order transferring the command of the army to General Hood, and the next morning, announcing his action to the Secretary of War, he permitted himself to say, quote, as to the alleged cause of my removal, I assert that Sherman's army is much stronger compared with that of Tennessee than Grant's compared with that of Northern Virginia. Yet the enemy has been compelled to advance much more slowly to the vicinity of Atlanta than to that of Richmond and Petersburg, and penetrated much deeper into Virginia than into Georgia. Unquote. Replying to the Secretary's charge that he expressed no confidence in his ability to defeat the enemy, he added, quote, confident language by a military commander is not usually regarded as evidence of competence. Unquote. General Hood, though he had been extremely free in his criticisms of Johnston, and had in fact done what he could to undermine the confidence of the Confederate War Department in his chief, felt himself greatly embarrassed by this sudden and unexpected promotion. He was, he himself says, comparatively a stranger to the Western Army. He was a fanatical admirer of Stonewall Jackson, and could see no merit in any military operations which differed from those of that energetic commander. He had not succeeded in inspiring that army with confidence or enthusiasm, and on the other hand, he entertained an opinion of the troops which he was to command, which was in itself a presage of disaster. He says, quote, "The troops of the Army of Tennessee had for such length of time been subjected to the ruinous policy pursued from Dalton to Atlanta that they were unfitted for united action in pitched battle. They had become wedded to the timid defensive policy, and naturally regarded with distrust a commander likely to initiate offensive operations." Unquote. On the morning of the 18th of July, General Hood, after a sleepless night, took General A. P. Stewart, who had succeeded to the command of Polk's corps, and rode to the quarters of General Johnston, and there requested that Johnston should pocket the Secretary's dispatch, leave Hood in command of his corps, and fight the battle for Atlanta. To this preposterous proposition Johnston naturally replied that the order of the President must stand unless it were countermanded. Hardee and Stewart then joined Hood in a telegram to Jefferson Davis, requesting that the order for removal be suspended, at least until the fate of Atlanta was decided. Jefferson Davis at once replied, quote, "A change of commanders under existing circumstances was regarded as so objectionable that I only accepted it as the alternative of continuing a policy which has proven disastrous. The order has been executed, and I cannot suspend it without making the case worse than it was before the order was issued." Unquote. Even after this telegram was received, Hood says that in a private interview he again urged Johnston to pocket the correspondence and resume his command. He lays great stress on this action in his memoirs, and seems to ascribe credit to himself and blame to Johnston that he refused to entertain this absurd proposal. Johnston explained his plan of attack upon Thomas at Peachtree Creek, and, if this were unsuccessful, his scheme to hold the lines with a part of his force and attack the right or left flank of the Federal army as might seem most expedient. Hood accepted Johnston's plan and at once set about carrying it into effect. The news of the change of Confederate commanders reached Sherman on the 18th. The information was conveyed by a newspaper which Frank L. Blair, Jr., had found at a farmhouse and sent to Sherman by a courier. He answered Blair, quote, "that it was very good news, but to look out for an attack; that Hood would make it very lively for us, and that it was necessary to be exceedingly cautious." Unquote. The news was received throughout Sherman's army with the greatest joy. Johnston's conduct from Tunnel Hill to Atlanta had been such as to inspire his adversaries with sincere respect. They had found him, at every move, posted across their path in the best chosen positions, behind intrenchments sometimes prepared with forethought, sometimes improvised on the instant, but always so disposed as to make his inferior force equal to twice its number. Cool, cautious, and imperturbable, he always held his ground as long as it was prudent to hold it, and then retired with such care and deliberation as to suffer the minimum loss in men and material. The leading officers of Sherman's army gathered together and hastily compared notes in regard to the new commander. He was personally known to McPherson, Howard, and Schofield. McPherson had been his intimate friend at West Point, had assisted him in his mathematics and helped him through the consequences of many a boyish scrape. Schofield said he was a man bold even to rashness, and courageous in the extreme. Howard gave the same testimony as to his courage and energy, and added that he was a man of little flexibility of mind. But all agreed that the change in commanders meant fighting, and before many hours the truth of this was shown. On the evening of the 20th of July, Hardee and Stewart, commanding respectively the corps of the center and left, made a furious attack upon Thomas's corps, which had just got into position on the banks of Peachtree Creek. Cheatham was left on the Confederate right to guard against the arrival of Schofield and McPherson. The battle was one of the hardest fought in this memorable campaign, but Hood's attack, apparently successful at first from the mere momentum with which it was made, met finally with a disastrous repulse. His army suffered more than twice the loss inflicted upon Thomas. The lines were so close together that in many places the troops became commingled and fought hand to hand, but in the end the Confederates were beaten back to their intrenchments, and the Union lines were strongly connected from north to the south of Atlanta, on the east. In this battle, Colonel Benjamin Harrison, afterwards President of the United States, won deserved distinction. Although General Hood pretends in his memoirs that the failure of his attack on the 20th was due to lack of energy on the part of Hardee, this was clearly an afterthought, adopted 6 months later, when the necessity presented itself of explaining his unbroken series of defeats. That he did not lose confidence in Hardee at that time was shown by his assigning to him, 2 days afterwards, the most important and daring enterprise of the campaign, and the one which came nearest succeeding. He was still haunted by the idea of emulating in the West the exploits of Stonewall Jackson in Virginia. The moment his attack on Peachtree Creek failed, he resolved to withdraw his army to the inner fortifications about Atlanta, and to detach a heavy force under Hardee to move by the right flank, pass beyond the Union left, and assail McPherson's flank and rear by a movement which he hoped to make overwhelming in celerity and momentum. This maneuver, which was skillfully planned by Hood, was executed by Hardee with admirable vigor and ability. On the morning of the 22nd, Sherman, finding the line in front of Thomas and Schofield abandoned, thought for a moment that the enemy had evacuated Atlanta, but, moving his whole line forward, he was soon undeceived. He found the inner intrenchments fully manned and strongly held, while shortly after, the rattle of musketry on McPherson's exposed left flank, and what was still more disquieting, the sound of distant artillery in the neighborhood of Decatur, where Joseph Wheeler's cavalry was attacking J.W. Sprague's brigade, put the whole army on the alert to confront the most serious danger to which it had ever been exposed. Sherman and McPherson were engaged in conversation at the moment this attack took place. Sherman instantly gave the necessary orders to meet the emergency, and McPherson rode to his endangered left flank. Fortunately, Hardee had already met with an unexpected and disconcerting obstacle. Instead of finding the vacant space he expected in rear of McPherson's flank, he came upon 2 divisions of Dodge's corps that were marching to join McPherson, and that had only to face into line to be ready to meet his attack. McPherson, seeing this part of the field so providentially provided for, turned to ride through a woodland path to the rear of the 17th Corps, and rushed in a moment upon a squad of Confederate skirmishers, who had penetrated the interval and filled the path which McPherson knew to be clear a moment before. In answer to their summons to surrender, he gave a military salute, and turning to gallop away, was shot dead from his horse. The animal, streaming with wounds, galloped back to where Sherman was still sitting, and a single orderly following conveyed to the commanding general the news of the great calamity which had befallen the army. In the midst of his grief for the loss of his friend, Sherman was greatly disquieted for fear McPherson's wallet, with important papers relating to the campaign, had fallen into the enemy's hands. But within a few moments the ground where he had fallen was regained by the Union troops, his captors captured in their turn, and the papers found in the haversack of a Confederate soldier. John A. Logan was put in temporary command of the Army of the Tennessee, and under the most trying circumstances conducted the fighting on the Union left throughout the day with perfect coolness and judgment. Hardee, in spite of the untoward meeting with Dodge's corps, pushed his attack with unshaken vigor and determination. It is a singular feature of the history of this battle that we must look for justice to the general who fought it, not from his own commander, but from his opponents. Hood, in his account of it, seeks ungenerously to lay upon the shoulders of Hardee the blame for its failure. He pretends that he did not pass beyond the flank of Blair, whereas he went completely to his rear, that he marched his force only 5 miles, when in fact he made a march of 15 before attacking. Hardee's right flank came, as we have said, against Dodge's command. It struck the latter in line of march, which was instantly converted into line of battle. But Hardee's left burst through the wooded space in rear of Blair, turning his left flank and taking his entrenchments in reverse. His march was as skillful, his attack as vigorous, as that of Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville, but he met with a far different resistance from the veterans of Dodge, Logan, and Blair, from that which was opposed to Jackson on Hooker's exposed right by the 11th Corps of the Wilderness of Virginia. The result proved that the Army of the Tennessee was panic-proof. Blair's soldiers, finding the enemy rushing upon their rear, simply leaped over their entrenchments, and fighting from the reverse side, repulsed them and drove them back with great slaughter. Nor was this the only test of their organization and their courage, for Hood, seeing that Hardee was fully engaged on the flank and rear, threw forward the force he had retained, in front of the 17th Corps, to support the flanking movement, so that these hardy soldiers, who from the reverse of their own entrenchments had repulsed the Confederates attacking in their rear, now leapt once more across their own works and drove back this second attack from their front. The Confederate attack on the Union front was made with such energy, and was so assisted by the formation of the ground, that a gap was opened near the point where McPherson's and Schofield's armies joined. This momentary mishap occurred under the very eyes of Sherman and Schofield, but was at once repaired by Sherman's ordering Schofield to mass his artillery so as to open on the Confederate flank as it pressed towards the east. Cheatham's advance was thus checked with frightful carnage. The 15th Corps rallied and made an irresistible countercharge, which drove the enemy back, re-establishing the line and gaining most of the captured guns. The fighting was too hot to last long. Cheatham and Hardee, being engaged upon the two sides of a right angle several miles apart, could not support each other with the efficiency required. Every instant when the troops of Logan and Blair were not fighting, they were digging, and a light line of entrenchments gradually grew up from the Union salient towards the southwest, which was called Leggett's Hill, from the gallant charge which General M.D. Leggett had made in capturing it the day before, to the point where Dodge's corps still stood in position, who had already covered their own front with that marvelous dexterity and rapidity which distinguished Sherman's army. Hardee's attack had been swift and strong, but the battle was not to him. Its crisis was already past, and although again and again the Confederate forces advanced to the attack with desperate valor, it was all clearly useless. G.W. Smith's Georgia militia struck with the courage of veterans against Schofield's position, but were easily and promptly driven back. Schofield, seeing the failure of the Confederate onset, suggested to Sherman that he could follow up the retreating enemy with his command, and interpose a corps between Hood's flanking force and the city of Atlanta, thus finishing the campaign with one crushing blow. Howard agreed to the suggestion, but Sherman, for several reasons, rejected it. The plan was perhaps not absolutely certain to succeed, and the success that had been gained was too much to expose to the risks of failure. And besides this, there was another consideration which had a singular influence with Sherman. His reply to Schofield's suggestion was, quote, "No, let the Army of the Tennessee fight it out this time." Unquote. It was his own army, the creation of his own genius, the pride of his heart. He was pleased to think that Hood's whole army had struck with all its force at the Army of the Tennessee, and that army, unaided, had beaten it back. It was only at nightfall that Hardee abandoned the desperately contested field and, making a half-wheel to the rear, withdrew his right wing to a point where he could still oppose the further operations of Sherman to the left flank. But Sherman had no such intention. In moving the Army of the Tennessee upon Decatur, and thence to Atlanta, his only purpose had been to destroy the Augusta road. That having been accomplished, and the desperate attack of Hood upon the left wing having been repulsed, Sherman at once resumed his original intention of moving by the right flank upon the southern line of communication supplying Atlanta. He left Schofield to stretch out so as to rest his left flank on the Augusta road, and then began to work the bulk of his force gradually around the north to the west of Atlanta. The first important matter demanding his attention, however, was the appointment of a successor to General McPherson to command the Army of the Tennessee. He could hardly hope to replace him, he wrote. Quote, "History tells us of but few who so blended the grace and gentleness of the friend with the dignity, courage, faith, and manliness of the soldier. His public enemies, even the men who directed the fatal shot, never spoke or wrote of him without expressions of marked respect. Those whom he commanded loved him even to idolatry, and I, his associate and commander, fail in words adequate to express my opinion of his great worth." Unquote. General Joseph Hooker was the one officer of that army who in distinction, in rank, and in service would have seemed designated for the vacancy, but his character and temperament were so uncongenial to Sherman that, as he frankly says, he never considered him for the place. General Logan, the commander of the 15th Corps, who had temporarily and with such brilliant valor and success taken charge of the Army of the Tennessee when McPherson fell, thought that he should have been permitted to retain the command, at least until the close of the campaign. Frank P. Blair, Jr., also had claims for the place which could not be despised. But Sherman's insuperable objection to both these able and devoted officers was that they were politicians, and throughout his career he cherished that vague and not quite intelligent suspicion of politicians to which we have already referred. He regarded Washington with whimsical horror as a sink of corruption and iniquity, and thought no good could come out of it. This prepossession sometimes had ludicrous results. Hearing that General Peter J. Osterhaus had been made a major general, and perhaps stung by the complaints of meritorious subordinates that their claims had not been recognized, he wrote on the 25th of July an angry dispatch to Washington, declaring that it was an act of injustice to officers who stood by their posts in the day of danger to neglect them and advance men like Osterhaus, who go to the rear in search of promotion. "If the rear," he says, "be the post of honor, then we had better all change front on Washington." This dispatch was shown to the President, who, instead of resenting its tone of disrespect and insubordination, wrote in his kindliest and calmest manner a letter to General Sherman, in which he informed him that the promotion of Osterhaus had been made upon written recommendations from no less trustworthy sources than Generals Grant and Sherman. But these recommendations had been made several months before, and Sherman's recollections of the Vicksburg campaign had somewhat faded in his mind during the fiery experiences of the last 60 days. He frankly acknowledged his error, and repeats in his memoirs that he was fairly caught. The government bore him no malice for this incident. They continued to comply heartily with every request he made. They even offered him, voluntarily, 8 promotions to the grade of brigadier general to be distributed on his recommendation among the most meritorious colonels in his command. It is curiously characteristic of the general that in his memoirs he attributes this proof of signal favor to his Osterhaus letter. He finally selected General O. Howard to command the Army of the Tennessee. This was a choice extremely agreeable to Schofield and Thomas, the commanders of the other armies, and General Howard was unquestionably a more comfortable person to live with than General Hooker. The results justified the appointment, and the faithful and devoted service which General Howard thenceforth rendered in his new command makes any vindication of Sherman's course in the matter now superfluous. But General Hooker naturally felt deeply outraged by this appointment. It was not merely that his rank was greater than that of Howard, but he felt that the primary cause of the failure at Chancellorsville, which deprived him of the place which he thought he merited as general-in-chief of the army, was due to Howard's fault. Howard went to the West as his subordinate, and Hooker had, up to that moment, exercised with unfailing ability and success a more important command than his junior. On the announcement of Howard's promotion, Hooker at once applied to be relieved of the command of the 20th Army Corps. Sherman warmly approved the application. D. S. Stanley was appointed to command the 4th Corps in place of Howard, and Slocum, as a final humiliation to Hooker, was brought back from Vicksburg and appointed to the command of the 20th Corps. The President did not share the prejudice which Sherman felt towards Hooker, but grateful to the former for his distinguished services, and relying upon him for the success of the arduous campaign in which he was engaged, he felt like denying him nothing which the general himself considered necessary to success. In this manner General Hooker retired from active service in the field. He was not, however, left idle. A few weeks later he was placed in command of the Northern Department, and the next year he commanded the Department of the East, and after the war, for a short period, the Department of the Lakes. He was mustered out of his volunteer commission in 1866, and 2 years later was retired from the service with the brevet rank of Major General in the Army of the United States. His health was at this time completely shattered, and a few years later he died. In the paralytic, querulous old man, whose only subjects of conversation were his grievances against McClellan, Meade, and Sherman, there was little to remind one of the bold, dashing, picturesque soldier of Williamsburg and Lookout Mountain. In the country at large he never lost his popularity, which was founded on a basis of brilliant abilities and honorable service, and gained the final touch of splendid legend in the Battle Above the Clouds. The road to Augusta having been so thoroughly destroyed, the road from Atlanta south to Macon became now the vital objective point of Sherman's campaign. While he pushed his heavy battalions continually to the right, he prepared important cavalry expeditions on both flanks for the purpose of cutting Hood's communications. His cavalry and infantry detachments both moved on the morning of the 27th of July. Our space will not allow us to detail the various striking and unexpected incidents which the two cavalry columns, the one to the right under Edward M. McCook, and the one to the left under Stoneman, met with in their march. It is enough to say that both expeditions virtually failed, though McCook saved his force and even inflicted some damage upon the enemy. From Stoneman great things were expected. His force was so large that it ought not to have been stopped by anything thrown in its way, and the task committed to him was one of the most inspiring allotted to any cavalry general in the war, being no less than to break the Macon Railroad and, after that, to proceed to Andersonville and liberate the 35,000 Union prisoners confined there, whose sufferings were a bitter affliction to the nation. This duty had been confided to him at his own request by General Sherman, who saw the difficulties in the way of it, but thought that even a chance of success would warrant the effort. "I will keep the enemy busy," wrote Sherman, "so that you shall have nothing to contend with but the cavalry, and if you can bring back to this army any or all of those prisoners of war, it will be an achievement that will entitle you and your command to the love and admiration of the whole country." Stoneman destroyed a large amount of rolling stock at Griswold, made a demonstration upon Macon, which failed, and then being intercepted and, as he supposed, surrounded by a force which ought not to have delayed him an hour, he gave orders to his brigade commanders to cut their way out, while he with a few hundred of his men occupied the attention of the enemy until it was too late to escape, and then surrendered. The movement of the infantry by the right flank at once attracted the attention of General Hood, who sent General S. D. Lee with his corps to attack the Federal flank upon the Lickskillet Road. The assault was made upon Logan's corps with great fury but indifferent success, and Hood dispatched the corps of General Stuart to the support of Lee. The greater part of his army was thus engaged in an assault upon Sherman's right flank. It was Howard's first battle in command of the Army of Tennessee, and, assisted by the devoted and brilliant services of his corps commanders, he defeated the Confederates with great slaughter. General Hood says, founding his opinion upon that of S.D. Lee, that the Confederate troops could not be brought to act unitedly. Quote, whilst one brigade fought gallantly, another failed to do its duty. Unquote. The officers on the Union side, who saw with what devoted valor the Confederates advanced upon the Federal entrenchments, laying their windrows of dead before the parapet, do not agree in this cruel censure inflicted by the Confederate commander upon his own troops. Hood, with the lack of logic that is seen in all of his operations, now concluded, because Sherman's operations in the Confederate rear had been of little effect, that he could accomplish the discomfiture of his adversary by a raid in the Union rear, hoping, as he says, that the movement would compel Sherman to retreat for want of supplies and thus allow him an opportunity of falling upon the Federal rear with his main body. He suggested this plan to Mr. Davis in Richmond. It met with his hearty concurrence. The terrible consequences of Hood's reckless aggressive policy were, it would seem, beginning to be appreciated in Richmond. Mr. Davis said, quote, the loss consequent upon attacking the enemy in his entrenchments requires you to avoid that if practicable. Unquote. And Hood at once ordered Wheeler, with 4,500 men, to begin operations. He threw himself in Sherman's rear with great activity, burned the bridge over the Etowah, recapturing Dalton and Resaca, destroying a long stretch of railroad track, and capturing some mules and horses. But this movement, comparatively successful as it was, produced no effect whatever upon Sherman's general plans. He ordered John Newton's division to Chattanooga and John M. Coursey's division to Rome, and adopting what measures seemed to him expedient for the repairing and further protection of the roads, pushed his forces steadily on by the right flank. He even took advantage of the absence of Wheeler to throw Judson Kilpatrick with a large force of cavalry upon the Macon road. Kilpatrick, with celerity and with what efficiency a mounted force could bring to bear upon such an object, performed the task allotted to him, and came back reporting that he had destroyed 3 miles of railroad about Jonesboro, that he had fought a division of infantry and a brigade of cavalry, and captured a battery and a few prisoners. He thought he had rendered the road useless for at least 10 days, but his calculations were, as usual in these cavalry raids, wide of the mark, and his report was hardly in before the rattle and whistle of the trains from the south were heard again in the National entrenchments. Sherman, after a month of more or less unsuccessful experiments, now made up his mind definitely that cavalry could not or would not work hard enough to disable a railroad properly. He wrote to Halleck on the 22nd of August after Kilpatrick returned, quote, I expect I will have to swing across to that road in force to make the matter certain, unquote. And having adopted that resolution, he lost not a moment in putting it into execution. Wheeler was up near the Hiawassee, wearing out his horses in a useless raid. The damage he had done to the railroad about Resaca and Dalton had been repaired. Sherman rode down to the Chattahoochee Bridge on the 24th and satisfied himself that it could be defended by a single corps left there for that purpose, by taking advantage of the Confederate works built there by Johnston, and returning to his camp, he telegraphed to Halleck that he would commence the movement round Atlanta by the south the next night, and that for some time they might expect at Washington to hear little from him. On the night of the 25th and the 26th, the whole army drew out of its trenches, abandoning the works it had taken the labor of so many hands to build, and the blood of so many brave men to defend, and swung off round Hood's left flank by the country roads to strike the Macon Railroad at Jonesboro. The corps of Stuart and Lee at once occupied the empty works. Hood, for a moment, with foolish exultation, adopted the belief that terror of Wheeler's cavalry had driven Sherman in retreat to the north across the Chattahoochee. It was not until the 28th that General Armstrong reported to Hood that the enemy was in large force at Fairburn on the West Point road. It became at once, he says, and the reader will not fail to appreciate the comic force of the adverb, quote, evident that General Sherman was moving with his main body to destroy the Macon road, and that the fate of Atlanta depended upon our ability to defeat this movement. Unquote. Sherman's primary object in this expedition was the destruction of the Macon road. A single sentence from his orders to General Thomas showed not only how minute was the attention that he gave to all the details of operations under his charge, but it also gives a most concise and graphic account of the manner in which he went about to destroy railroads. Quote, my own experience demonstrates the proper method to be to march a regiment to the road, stack arms, loosen 2 rails opposite the right and 2 opposite the left of the regiment, then to heave the whole track, rails and ties, over, breaking it all to pieces. Then pile the ties in the nature of crib work, and lay the rails over them. Then, by means of fence rails, make a bonfire, and when the rails are red hot, let men give the rail a twist which cannot be straightened without machinery. Also fill up some of the cuts with heavy logs and trunks of trees and branches, and cover up and fill with dirt. Unquote. Howard marched in advance on the right wing. Thomas held the center and Schofield the left. The 29th was spent in thoroughly breaking the West Point Railroad according to General Sherman's graphic directions. Howard then moved on towards Jonesboro, Schofield on the left towards Rough and Ready, and Thomas in easy support towards Renfrew's. With an adversary like Hood, it was almost impossible for Sherman to foresee and guard against his possible eccentricities. Sherman describes Schofield's attitude as, quote, daring and inviting the enemy to sally out and to attack him, unquote, which Hood says he would have done had not Sherman, quote, been doubly protected by the Chattahoochee, deep intervening creeks and ravines extending to the river, and his wall of parapets. This move not being practicable by reason of these obstructions, I was forced, he says, to await further developments. Unquote. The developments were speedily furnished him. The whole army moved straight for the Macon Railroad. On the 30th, Schofield reached it near Rough and Ready, Thomas at 2 points below, while Howard, arriving at the Flint River, pushed boldly across. Hazen's division carrying the further bank and the barricades which defended it. Logan rushed his whole corps over and took the high ground between the river and the railroad, where he strongly entrenched himself, Hazen on the left and William Harrow on the right, Osterhaus being in reserve. T.E.G. Ransom was placed in position west of the river facing the south, and Blair, when he arrived next morning, faced his corps northeast in the rear of Logan's left. Bridges were hastily constructed, by which Logan on the east and Blair and Ransom on the left were put thoroughly in communication. Hood had by this time recovered from the confusion into which he had been thrown, and had sent Hardee and Lee to attack Sherman's right wing under Howard. In the afternoon of the 31st, Hardee made his assault, the brunt of the fighting falling upon Hazen's division. Hood had given him the orders, so easy to give and so difficult to execute, to attack and drive the enemy across Flint River. This being done, he says, he intended to attack Sherman in flank, with Stewart's corps and the militia whom he retained in Atlanta. Whether or not it be that Hardee, having lost all confidence in the capacity of his commander, attacked with less than his usual energy, his distrust insensibly communicating itself to his troops, the fact is that the Confederate attack here lacked its usual impetuosity. Hood himself says in his official report that the number of men on the Confederate side considerably exceeded that of the enemy, yet the attack failed, easily being repulsed in every part of the field, and in the evening Hood, appearing by this time to have completely lost his head, ordered Lee's corps to march back and take position in the vicinity of Rough and Ready. Lee marched as he was ordered, and Hardee did his best, by holding a bold front and stretching out his lines, to disguise from the enemy this fatal diminution of his forces. If Howard had known that half of Hardee's army had marched to the north, he could have made short work of the rest, but, as Sherman once observed, there was this great disadvantage in fighting with a fool: you could never conceive what he was going to do. Sherman and Thomas arrived on the ground on the afternoon of the 1st of September, and hearing from Howard what he had just ascertained of the departure of Lee, Sherman hurried orders in every direction for the Army of the Cumberland to push forward and assault Hardee, hoping to capture the whole of his corps. One aide after another was dispatched upon this quest, and at last General Thomas himself rode off at a gallop to bring forward his troops. Several chroniclers think it worthy of mention that this was the first time in the war that the ponderous and deliberate hero of Chickamauga was seen to move with such undignified haste. But the night came too quickly on, and Hardee made his escape. Sherman had sent orders to Slocum to feel forward cautiously from the Chattahoochee, to ascertain what Hood was doing at Atlanta. All night Sherman, unable to sleep, waited in restlessness and impatience for the dawn. About midnight he heard from the north sounds like distant detonations. Instead of asking one of his experienced officers of the staff his opinion as to these sounds, he took the characteristic course of waking up a farmer in the neighborhood and asking him what he thought of them. He replied, with the positiveness derived from his summer's education, that it sounded like a battle at Atlanta, and Sherman could only wait for the morning to come to solve the doubt in his mind whether Hood was blowing up his own magazines or Slocum had reached forward and had engaged him in fight. When morning came, it was ascertained that Hardee was gone, and Sherman, starting after him in hot pursuit, came upon his lines at a point near Lovejoy's Station. Here, while feeling the new Confederate position, rumors began to arrive that Atlanta had fallen, and later in the day a letter from Slocum confirmed the momentous news. Slocum had heard the sounds which had so disturbed Sherman, and moving rapidly from the bridge at daylight, had entered Atlanta without opposition. Sherman sent the news to Thomas. This imperturbable soldier, who yesterday had for the first time galloped his horse, now, says Sherman, snapped his fingers, whistled, and almost danced. Unquote. Hood saw there was no hope for Atlanta from the moment that Hardee was repulsed at Jonesboro. He says in his memoirs that, had it not been for the necessity of keeping his army between Sherman and the Andersonville prison, he would have met Sherman's bold movement by another far more bold, and it may be said less judicious, that is, to move north across Peachtree Creek and the Chattahoochee, and take a position near the Alabama line across Sherman's line of supplies. But this plan never had a chance of realization. He stopped Lee's corps on its northward march near Rough and Ready, posted him so as to protect the Confederate left flank, marched out of Atlanta at 5 o'clock on the McDonnell Road, and concentrated his army at Lovejoy Station. Sherman telegraphed on the 3rd to Washington, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. Since the 5th of May we have been in one constant battle or skirmish, and need rest." He concluded to make no further pursuit from that point, but ordered his army back to Atlanta on the 5th of September. Ungrudging honors were paid by the government to Sherman and his troops for this magnificent achievement, one of the most important that the cause of the country had yet gained, not only in the value of its results, but in the skill and good conduct by which it was brought about. The President issued an order in these words, "The national thanks are tendered by the President to Major General W. T. Sherman and the gallant officers and soldiers of his command before Atlanta for the distinguished ability, courage, and perseverance displayed in the campaign in Georgia which, under divine favor, has resulted in the capture of Atlanta. The marches, battles, sieges, and other military operations that have signalized the campaign must render it famous in the annals of war, and have entitled those who have participated therein to the applause and thanks of the nation." Grant telegraphed Sherman from City Point, In honor of your great victory, I have ordered a salute to be fired with shotted guns from every battery bearing upon the enemy. The salute will be fired within an hour amidst great rejoicing." Unquote. Thus, with the thunder of guns, with the ringing of bells, the tumultuous rejoicings of a great people, was celebrated this momentous victory. End of chapter 12. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.